I'm a teacher at San Francisco Zen Center, and she teaches classes, lectures, and leads retreats in Northern California. And she co-founded the Sangha in Recovery program at San Francisco Zen Center, which some of us were a part of. And she is the abiding teacher of Lenox House in Oakland. And she has written a book recently entitled The Zen Way of Recovery, an illuminated path out of the darkness of addiction. So right up our alley, right? She is, she's also the author of two children's books, Buddhist Stories for Kids and Zen for Kids, which I just love. And you can purchase all these online through San Francisco Zen Center bookstore or Amazon or wherever wherever you can find them. And
The Shambhala website as well.
Shambhala, yes.
Yes. But
Yeah.
what I'd really love for people to do, if you'd like to see the book, it's available in a lot of libraries, but also you can get it at an independent bookstore or ask for it to be delivered to an independent bookstore. So it's widely available. And it
And
looks like this, The Zen Way of Recovery. Thanks, Kirk.
and Laura's work has appeared in many journals, Tricycle Magazine, Buddha Dharma, The Best of the Wind Bell, Teach Our Children Well, and she has been in the film The Digital Divide. So that's just the tip of the iceberg. She's a good friend and a wonderful person,
Oh.
and I'm in awe of her practice. So no further ado, here's Laura.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Cynthia. And it's wonderful to see your faces on the screen. I really appreciate that because Zoom is a little bit alienating. And so if I could see your face, it's very helpful. And I know for some people that's something they don't want to do, and that's okay too. I want to tell you a little bit about how I came to write this book, The Zen Way of Recovery. In my early 20s, I lived in Juneau, Alaska. And that's when I really entered what I call the heart of darkness, that is alcohol abuse. You know, when I first got to Juneau, it was wonderful fun. I knew a lot of young people up there, and I spent a lot of time at the Dreamland and the Red Dog Saloon. And I had a good time. But as I got there in May and the sun was shining, and as the months went by and the darkness descended on Juneau so that it was dark most of the time in the wintertime, it paralleled the darkness of addiction that I was experiencing. And one of the things that really got my attention was I came to out of a blackout crawling in the snow. And I knew that people die that way in those kind of northern climates. And so I decided to come back to San Francisco, and there was a little glimmer of hope in me that thought maybe I could find a spiritual solution to this problem of my life. And I found myself at the San Francisco Zen Center, and I just quit drinking. I just stopped and I practiced. We say in Zen, I practiced as if to save my head from fire. And within a very short time, I was living at Tassara Zen Mountain Center, Zen Center's monastery. And I loved the rigor of monastic life, learning about the precepts, which to me were the opposite of alcoholism. You know, chopping wood, carrying water, getting up at 4:30 in the morning, splashing some cold water on my face, putting on my black robes and going to the Zendo. And it was a very dynamic time I'm very, very grateful for. But when I left the monastery and I was living in San Francisco with my daughter Nova and her dad, alcohol started creeping back into my life. The first line in my book, The Zen Way of Recovery, is Buddhism did not cure my alcoholism. You know, in spite of sitting many 7-day sessions and having the benefit of wonderful teachers, alcohol took a hold of me again. Not with the wild abandon of my youth, but a really, really isolated kind of secret drinking because it wasn't acceptable for me to drink the way I really tend to drink as somebody who's prone to the craving for alcohol. And so after 5 years, I decided to go back to school and get my teaching credential. I was sitting in a classroom at San Francisco State, and I had a moment of clarity. I was flooded with this realization that in order to be worthy to teach children, I couldn't drink alcohol as well. And I also thought of many wonderful Buddhist teachers who could shower us with wonderful Dharma talks, but because they couldn't apprehend their own addiction, whether to sex or substances or power, they destroyed or harmed their sanghas. And so I got up out of that classroom, and I was shaking and sick from the night before, from drinking the night before. I went and made a phone call that changed my life, and I entered the rooms of recovery. And that has made all the difference. And I embarked on teaching children, and I taught third grade for 35 years. And I was a very different teacher because I was sober and because I was practicing Buddhism. You know, I thought that I could put on black robes and chant in Japanese and be a different person. But I had to turn around and look at the darkness that is addiction and do the work we do in recovery in order for my Zen practice to bloom. You know, I was so distracted by the obsession of alcohol that I couldn't practice wholeheartedly. And I really didn't realize that until I did stop. And my sobriety date is September 28th, 1985. So I'd love to share a chapter from my book, The Zen Way of Recovery. I noticed you've been studying some of the spokes on the wheel of the Noble Eightfold Path. And one of those spokes is right speech. And so I'd love to speak about an aspect of right speech that has to do with humor. And I began this chapter with the quote. I did H&I worked taking AA meetings to San Francisco General for 25 years. And I walked in there one day and there was a quote on the blackboard. Somebody had written, "I don't remember having a spiritual experience, but something sure as hell must have happened." And I so identified with that because I found that the spiritual experience of recovery was a gradual one. And so I'd love to share this chapter called The Importance of Humor from my book, The Zen Way of Recovery. Each morning at the three temples associated with the San Francisco Zen Center, City Center, Green Gulch Farm, and Tassajara Zen Mountain Center, we chant the names of our ancestors, the men and women, practitioners of our lineage who stretch all the way back to the Buddha. Tendo Nyojo is an important name in the lineage, as he gave Dharma transmission to our great Zen ancestor, Dogen Zenji, and he's the monk that brought Zen from China back to Japan. Now there's a custom among Zen masters right before they die to dash off a haiku, and this is Tendo Nyojo's. He wrote, "I've given you my all, tossing it your way with a hearty laugh. I entrust it all to the spring wind, for there is nothing more that I need to do. I've given you my all. Despite the truth of impermanence, of the illusory nature of existence, of suffering, still I've given you my all." And Tendo Nyojo was confident that his life was complete. It's as if he was drawing a sumi circle in the air, tossing it your way with a hearty laugh. In recovery, for those of you who might be in recovery, and I do want to say, I think we're all in recovery from something. So, you know, if you're not literally in recovery from substance abuse or a behavioral addiction of some kind, we've all suffered some loss or a barrage of negative thoughts. We're all recovering from something. And in the rooms of recovery, I've often heard it said, we are not a glum lot. One of the surprising things to me when I stepped into the rooms of recovery was the laughter. And this laughter stems from the joy we feel at having survived a potentially deadly disease and living to tell the truth with our fellow survivors. humor is an important part of our Zen practice as well. Suzuki Roshi endured many tragedies in his life. And I didn't meet Suzuki Roshi. He died before I came to Zen Center. But I didn't even learn about what he'd been through till I read his biography by David Chadwick, which is called Crooked Cucumber, a wonderful book about his path in Zen. The stories that I've heard about Suzuki Roshi from his students reveal both his fierceness and his buoyant sense of humor. Now, how can we laugh when there's so much suffering in the world? Yet we have filmed images of Suzuki Roshi playing with a yo-yo and laughing gleefully. Perhaps this is one of the paradoxes of Zen. A Zen master of the 20th century who's experienced great tragedies playing with a yo-yo, and a Zen master of the 13th century tossing off his death poem, with a hearty laugh. My hope is that for you, practice and recovery are attended by laughter. And laughter erupts from empathy, from recognition of our common plight, from seemingly disparate things coming together in surprising ways, as a relief from the stresses and vagaries of life. On my bookshelf, the cartoonist Roz Chast sits there right next to Dogen Zenji. So her truth through her cartoons is just as important to me as Dogen Zenji's moon in a dewdrop. Recently, I think I'll skip that part. Josh Kornbluth is a wonderful monologist. He does a one-man show. He's been performing many different one-person shows for many years. And he was a guest at the Zen Hospice Project and then a fellow at the Memory and Aging Clinic at the University of California. And when Josh was a child, he was a red diaper baby. His father and mother were communists. And his father told Josh when he was knee-high to a grasshopper that he was going to grow up and lead the communist revolution in the United States. Well, that hasn't happened yet. But at the Memory and Aging Clinic, as a fellow, as a resident artist, Josh had to come up with a project. And so the project he decided to work on was a worldwide revolution in empathy. Now, people who have prefrontal dementia, which is what they study at the Memory and Aging Clinic, this is fascinating. On an MRI, you can see that the empathy center in their brain has gone dark. It's atrophied. This is one of the diagnoses of prefrontal dementia, that their empathy center has gone dark. So a woman who may have been very compassionate towards babies will look at her granddaughter blankly and turn away. So Josh asked one of the neurologists at the clinic what we can do to deepen our empathy with one another, especially at a time when there are such huge divisions and disparities and dismay in our country. And what these neurologists told him was that if someone who has had a deep prejudice against another group, say some people of another religion or of another race, if that person has a transformative experience with a person, with an individual of that race or religion, they can begin to feel a spark of empathy within themselves. We've heard stories of former gang members or white nationalists who've been transformed by the power of love and by disavowing violence and hatred. But the neurologist gave another example: storytelling. We transform one another by listening to one another's stories. When I hear your story, my brain is literally changed. The neurons in my brain include you now. They make a path for you in my brain. And as you speak, your image is literally in my eyes, and your voice is in my ears. When you hear my story, you are changed. When we listen to one another with open hearts and minds, we are transformed. This is not poetic. This is literal science. This is an invitation to all of us to listen to one another's stories with open hearts and minds and help a little bit with this worldwide revolution in empathy. And I love stories from every tradition. Here's a story that I wrote recently. I'm working now on a book of wisdom stories from Japan. This is a story about Ikkyu, who was a little boy. He was an orphan growing up in a monastery in Japan, but he was a very clever, very, very smart little guy. And adults love to try to trick him. Well, one day, Ikkyu's master heard someone at the door, and there was a neighbor woman there. And she told Ikkyu's master, I've brought you homemade mochi. You may know mochi is a wonderful treat with a sweet center. And she handed the master this box of mochi. And he thanked her and sent her on her way. He noticed that Ikkyu, who was a monk, Ikkyu was a monk, but also a little boy with a sweet tooth, that he was looking at this box of mochi. And his teacher told him, you know, this type of mochi is very special. It's like medicine for adults, but it's poison for children. So be very careful not to eat the mochi, or you'll get very, very, it would be very, very dangerous for you to eat the mochi. And the master went out to sweep the rock garden. Well, Ikkyu was no fool. He thought to himself, gee, poison for children and medicine for adults? I don't think so. So he called two of his little friend monks to him, and he said, the master told me that mochi is poison for children, but medicine for adults. I don't believe him. I think he wants the mochi all to himself. Let's eat them. So the little boys sat down on the floor. They're eating mochi, having a great time. And then when they got all done, one of the boys said, wait a minute. When the teacher comes back, he's going to see we've eaten all the mochi. What are we going to do? And the clever Ikkyu said, don't worry, I have a plan. I have a plan. He took them in the kitchen and he told the little boys, put water on your face as if you've been crying. And then Ikkyu took from the shelf this beautiful tea bowl, which was his master's favorite tea bowl. He bowed deeply to the bowl, and then he threw it on the floor and it broke into dozens of pieces. Well, the other boys were aghast, but they heard Ikkyu said, act like you're crying, act like you're crying. They could hear the teacher coming back down the hall. Ikkyu rubbed his eyes as if they were red. Well, when the teacher came into the room, he said, boys, what's wrong? What's wrong? And Ikkyu said, Master, I'm so ashamed. I'm so ashamed. I've broken your favorite tea bowl. And so now I've punished myself by eating the poison mochi, and now I must die. And the other little boys started saying, Ikkyu, we'll miss you. We'll miss you. Well, of course, the master got down on his knees and took Ikkyu by the hands and said, Ikkyu, I've been very selfish and very foolish. And from that time on, whenever anybody brought food to the temple as an offering, the master would share it with the little boys. You know, so in this story, the student became the master of the master. There are a lot of wonderful, funny stories like this. One of the things I loved about Zen was the very funny stories I started hearing in Dharma talks. It seems that we begin to lose our sense of humor as we enter our 20s. According to the behavioral scientist, and I don't know how they figure this stuff out, according to the behavioral scientist Jennifer Acker of Stanford University, a Gallup poll conducted in 166 countries found that the average 4-year-old laughs about 300 times a day, but it takes 2.5 years for a 40-year-old to accrue that much laughter. Yet laughter has many benefits. Having a sense of humor, being able to laugh at ourselves and at the vicissitudes of life can be a wonderful buffer against spiraling down into a pit of depression and dismay about the state of the world. And as the American Zen master Mel Brooks says, humor has been my delicious refuge from the world. Even the Queen of England has her rough days. I remember several years ago, part of one of her palaces burned down, and her grown children were misbehaving and being described unbecomingly in the press. And in her annual New Year's speech to the nation, she said, with characteristic British understatement, "It is not a year upon which I will look back with undiluted joy." God bless her, the Queen of England. Suzuki Roshi was a powerful presence, though only about 4 feet 11 inches tall. And in his lectures, he laughed a lot. I heard that at the beginning of a sesshin, a 7-day sitting, he said to the students who were sitting zazen all around him, "The problems you are having now are the problems you will have for the rest of your life." And he threw his head back and started laughing. And Dogen Zenji might have had a pretty good sense of humor too. Dogen Zenji referred to life as one continuous mistake. So here are some aspects that I think cultivating a sense of humor are important for us, to not take our practice or our recovery or ourselves too seriously. Of course, the first thing is that everything is changing, so why not laugh? One of the invitations to lighten up and have a sense of humor is that everything is constantly shifting and changing. Whatever we're upset about today may change completely tomorrow. David Chadwick, a Zen priest at Zen Center for many years, and the author, as I said, of Crooked Cucumber, Suzuki Roshi's biography, he asked Roshi, if you could sum up the truth of Buddhism in one phrase, what would it be? And Suzuki Roshi answered without hesitation, everything changes. Well, I would have to add, except Jennifer Aniston. I don't know if you've noticed, she never changes. Sometimes things are so outrageously bad that all we can do is laugh. Even when we're going through the darkest of times, we can find comfort in laughter and with those we trust the most. If you've ever been to a Zen memorial service, we even laugh about the wonderful foibles and characteristics of the person who's passed. For Day of the Dead, I used to ask my third graders if they could share a story about maybe one of their pets who died, because by the time they were in third grade, usually they'd experienced that type of impermanence. And Chris in my class, she told us, she said, "I'll tell you about the day all my pets died at the same time." Well, there was a stunned silence when she said that. So she said she went to a soccer game one day and she left her hamster running around her bedroom. Somehow the hamster got up on top of her bunk bed and jumped or launched itself or fell off the bunk bed into her fishbowl and drowned, and all the fish flew out onto the floor and were flopping around and had died. She figured this all out from the scene. Well, again, there was silence, and then, somebody giggled a little bit, and then somebody else laughed, and pretty soon even Chris was laughing, and I said, "You know what? It's okay to laugh. Sometimes things are so bad, all you can do is laugh." And if they'd been a little bit older, I might have shared with them a quote from Samuel Beckett. His observation was, when you're up to your neck in shit, there's nothing for it but to sing. A good admonition, I think. Humor conveys our affection for and our connection with one another. Sometimes you meet someone and you immediately know from their sense of humor that there's an affinity there. With old friends, we remember stories from the past that make us laugh. My daughter Nova and I have been through a lot together, and we thoroughly enjoy one another's company as adults. I recently came across a Mother's Day card she gave me a couple of years ago. On the front it said, "I got born, I grew up, I left home, I got a job, I'm not in prison." And on the inside, what more could a mother want? Humor can transform an argument and help you and someone you love remember shared bonds. I remember many funny moments I shared with my third graders. I was out in Point Reyes a while ago, and one of my former students, who was then about 25 years old, approached me. She said, I'm Anna. Maybe you don't remember me, but I was in your class. And I said, Anna, not only do I remember you, I remember when you raised your hand in class and said, Laura, what happens after you die? I forget. I try to remember to remind myself not now and then not to be surprised when third graders acted like third graders. This was when I was teaching. And humor can really point to a larger truth. When I have this realization that third graders are going to act like third graders, I thought I also shouldn't be surprised when people act like people. As my friend James says, people, they're not what they're cracked up to be. Humor's often based on making connections between seemingly unconnected things, and humor can take us by surprise. One day I was walking in the hallway behind a couple of my students, and I heard Talia say to Tess, "Would you rather be buried or cremated?" And Tess replied, "I don't know, surprise me." Self-deprecating humor has its place. We find humility when we don't take ourselves so seriously. This can help us cultivate a kind of warm detachment. Through practice, we can catch ourselves being self-righteous, and we feel a little silly. I read about a woman who felt that humility is a spiritual practice, and she found herself looking around the room saying, I've got more humility than anybody in this room. But of course, she had to laugh out loud when she caught herself thinking that. Maybe part of humility is to have a sense of humor even about our shortcomings. We can stop expecting ourselves to be perfect. We can transform that negative voice in our head that is chastising us for making mistakes into a loving friend who will always be there for us, even when we're not at our best. Humor isn't necessarily benign. In fact, it can be quite aggressive. A comedian who does well says they killed it or they destroyed it. If they don't do well, they say they died or they bombed. I've listened to comics talk about their craft, and many of them were painfully shy as kids or developed humor as a defense. They talk about using a sense of humor to make a depressed parent laugh or to distract a bully on the playground when they were young. I grew up in a household where there was a lot of teasing, and I learned to give as good as I could get. And this led to my sometimes having a bit of a sharp tongue as a kind of defense mechanism. One of the best compliments you could get at my dinner table was if someone teased you and you came back with a zinger, my dad would say, "Good comeback." Sometimes I don't look forward to seeing someone because their default position is to mock me. The literal meaning of the word sarcasm is to rip the flesh, to rip the flesh. And we can use humor sometimes at someone else's expense. I've certainly teased others or said something glib that I immediately wished I could retrieve. I like the expression, I would have bitten my tongue if my foot hadn't been in my mouth. I notice, though, that I don't often tease people I don't already feel comfortable with. Still, it's worth asking when teasing is gentle affection and when it is disguised hostility. Of course, we should practice diligently, as if to save our head from fire. But I hope we can bring some silliness and generosity and humor to the path of practice and recovery. When my daughter was a teenager, she walked through the living room and glanced at a bunch of Pema Chodron's books on the coffee table. The Wisdom of No Escape, When Things Fall Apart, The Places That Scare You, No Time to Lose. And Nova said, geez, what a drama queen. And I had a chance to share that with Pema Chodron. And she really got a kick out of that. So humor can help us stop taking ourselves and our opinions so seriously. This is a form of detachment, not a cold, cynical detachment, not a refusal to engage with the world, but a warm-hearted detachment that comes from recognizing the truth of impermanence, from understanding that the difficulties we're experiencing, the dark time we may be going through, is just another part of the path and will pass away like everything else. Shall we remember the words of Tendo Nyojo? I've given you my all, tossing it your way with a hearty laugh. I entrust it all to the spring wind, for there is nothing more that I need to do. So thank you so much for your kind attention. And we will engage in meditation now. I'd like at the beginning of the meditation just to suggest, while you're meditating, to suggest some reflections about humor and right speech.
Laura, thanks.
Thank
Let's
you.
sit for about 10 or 15 minutes. I'll ring the bells. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank
Kurt.
you, Laura.
Taking some deep breaths, we allow our breath to extend to the farthest reaches of our body and to extend out into the world, recognizing our deep interconnection with all beings. As we consider humor and right speech, we might take up these reflections. And I'll just suggest them, and please hold them for a moment and then let them go. Do I use humor to connect with others? Do I use humor to build bonds of affection and identification? Do I use humor to diffuse an otherwise tense situation? Do I use humor to relieve stress in a lighthearted moment with others? Do I use humor to mock and belittle others? Do I use humor to keep people at a distance or to disguise my real feelings or who I really am? Do I fall back on humor when I honestly don't even know how I really feel? Is humor a reflection of joy and love and delight at this crazy reality we find ourselves in? Or is it used to shame and diminish? How can I use humor in a wholesome way? Can I find humor and at the same time engage in right speech and avoid doing harm?